environmental, social and governance targets are now increasingly making themselves felt in the manufacturing sector. I'm Jonty Bloom. I'm a freelance journalist these days, but I had 30 years working as a business journalist at the BBC. And I think I can safely say when I started that ESG was a very small cloud on a distant horizon. But as the latest report by Make UK and Lloyds from earlier this year found, that has all changed. 2/3 of manufacturers now have ESG targets. That number is rising all the time. And perhaps most importantly, customers are increasingly demanding that those targets be part of your business. And 3/4 of firms are now including ESG conditions in their procurement strategies. To discuss what that means, illustrate the challenges, demonstrate best practice, and how best to work together with your customers and suppliers, we've gathered quite a team. And they're going to take us through the issues and the opportunities, and I'll be saying as little as possible because they know what they're talking about far better than I do. So we're joined by Alice Conway, Associate Director of Sustainability and ESG Finance at Lloyds Bank, Waleed Montasa, Senior Learning Delivery Consultant at Make UK, John Thewlis, Joint Managing Director at Thomas Broadbent, the Yorkshire-based manufacturing concern, and Charlotte Ilkew, who's Global Head of HR at Thomas Broadbent, and of course James Broom, who's Make UK's Senior Economist. Now he's going to take us through what the report found and why it matters. And we're going to start with that, James, so off you go.
Thank you very much, Jonty, and good morning, everyone. Just a moment while I put up some slides. All right, brilliant. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. And so this is quite exciting for us at Make UK because actually it was arguably long overdue, some of our work on ESG. It's actually the report that we published earlier this year is the first formal piece of work on ESG that we've done in the manufacturing sector, and arguably it was a bit of a policy gap that we might have had in our policy remit. We partnered with Lloyds to deliver this work, and it's quite a comprehensive piece of work. So I do recommend, if you are interested in any of these findings, that you go and find the report. That will be no doubt disseminated with the pack either before or after this meeting, or it's also available, I imagine, if you give it an internet search. Because with the limited time today, and to allow the experts some proper time to speak, to hear from the manufacturing industry themselves, and of course the interventions that banks such as Lloyds can come up with to address and assist businesses with these challenges, I'll keep this to about 10 minutes or so. But what we'll do, we'll start by going over the scope of the work, why we went about it, where ESG sits as a concern in the sector, but critically, the growth. And we've got the real benefit of being able to use some unpublished data from 2 years ago that we surveyed from our membership, that we were able to create, somewhat of a short time series with a really interesting effect. So as part of the scope of work, we want to understand how prevalent is ESG in the sector, specific to manufacturers, and critically, where does it sit within the business? And then the other focus that was a real core point is about, of course, UK manufacturing sits so often in the middle of many supply chains. We wanted to know to what degree is the sector subject to ESG conditions and playing into a larger supplier, and to what degree are the respondents and our members themselves setting conditions for their suppliers. And so it's that relationship up and down the chain and the impacts of how ESG plays into that we wanted to understand. And of course, at the time of publication, and still, there's very little literature around this in sort of setting the bar about where we are for creating that data time series going forwards. So to start with, a lot of what we're going to see is, of course, that spread in company size, because what we do know through intuition and through other learnings, that it's obviously the larger companies, the primes, that are often setting these conditions initially, the first to take up some of these mantles. And then we see it sometimes flood down through the supply chain as those conditions filter down through. So just as a very first data point, we can see here in terms of whether a firm has a dedicated ESG function, whether that's an individual person or indeed a whole team. We can see companies that report having such a thing, it's about 1.7 times more likely in terms of the prevalence in the data for those very large corporates, the 500 million pound plus turnover, which we're seeing at the top of the graph there, versus the smaller 10 to 50 million pound businesses. And with regards to those businesses that do and don't have targets, and what's the difference between a target and a strategy, we can look at this. And I know this is a little confusing, but don't worry, I'll explain it. Of course, there is a slightly nuanced difference between what we've defined as having a formal ESG strategy, which is, the question we asked the participants, versus having ESG targets and KPIs. And what I mean by an ESG target and KPI, that might be, for example, something like, as we'll see in a moment, executive compensation linked to ESG targets, emissions targets, and those sorts of things. Whereas a strategy would be more so an altogether published document that the company is rallying behind. But you can see actually that's pretty much quite consistent, but the sector is slightly more likely to have just targets and KPIs vis-a-vis than having both. But how does this spread out in terms of having those targets and varying them by company size? I think in part of the wider report, I should say there's all sorts of targets that we cut across all sorts of sectors and company sizes as well. But I think one of the more interesting ones I want to show you, because I think it's quite telling of how a company might be taking its ESG forwards, is whether or not executive pay is linked to ESG targets. And you have a really strong correlation here across company size, as proxied by turnover bands there on the bottom axis. So you can see into those smallest of businesses, 10% was actually perhaps higher than we'd expected report having their executive pay or executive compensation linked to ESG targets, but right the way up to the slim majority of those largest of corporates, the 500 million plus category, 55%, suggesting that their executive pay is linked to ESG targets. You see that goes right the way through without. Now, in a similar fashion, with regards to external auditing of ESG, something interesting happens here. And of course, this report wasn't just based on fieldwork. It included a wide range of case studies from primes to SMEs. And it's all included in the report to understand these findings and find out some nuance. And one of the interesting nuances we found, particularly with this graph, is that when a company breaks that certain size, and typically we see an internal ESG department, for lack of a better word, form, and that auditing goes away from being external and becomes more internal, which is where we see the prevalence drop off in those 1,000 plus. Now you're looking at headcount, you're not looking at turnover anymore on the bandings at the bottom. And this graph is representing the prevalence of respondents reporting whether their ESG reporting is externally auditing, of course. We see that actually drop off over the 1,000 plus category, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's those larger companies that aren't auditing their ESG reporting. It's more so that there's that company size, there tends to be an internal audit, internal department that handles that sort of thing. Now, as I mentioned at the start, one of the luckiest things we were able to do with this, inaugural piece of work was to have that unpublished data from 2 years prior in 2021. And although we published this work this year, the data collection period was at the tail end of 2023, which is why you see 2023 on that column heading there. And I think if you just draw your attention to the bottom right, and what you're looking at here is effectively the reported prevalence of all of these concerns by the manufacturing sector in the UK. That's the percentage of companies that report having that as part of their business, whatever it might be, ESG reporting, formal ESG strategies. But you see the real growth there is ESG KPIs in the business, going from 42% reporting to 62%. And now, that's a 20 percentage point increase. And if you want to, be relative about it, that's almost a 50% increase in relative terms. With the only thing, of course, decreasing is ESG reporting being audited. Now, there's a few reasons for this. And of course, you've got to remember what was going on between 2021 and 2023. It was hardly, plain sailing for the sector or in the whole economy, indeed. So it's quite impressive that we saw growth in these various facets of ESG, despite the business headwinds that were going on at the time. And some suggestion is, well, perhaps ESG reporting audit declined in that period because it represented a cost, whereas some of the other concerns didn't represent an immediate cost to the business. And of course, during that 21 to 23 period, costs were in the limelight in that period. Now, in terms of procurement policy, I won't spend too much time on this because I think this is what some of the experts are going to talk to you about. But you'll be interested to see that, of course, a lot of these things in terms of the prevalence of the sector reporting, whether they have or have not these various concerns as part of their procurement policy, a lot of these things long predate the concept of the sort of the semantics of the term ESG, health and safety, human rights, labor rights. All top three of those that the reports have them built into the manufacturers' procurement policy are all focused on human capital, with it then growing down throughout in terms of prevalence in procurement, so waste, carbon emissions, social value impact, energy management systems, and right the way down to biodiversity. Now, what about that spread, that balance between conditions set by suppliers and required by customers. Actually quite a balanced metric there. 77% suggest that they are subject to ESG conditions set by their customers, and then 74% say they set ESG conditions for their suppliers. Now, of course, this is somewhat makes sense because of the manufacturing sector in the UK sits so often in the middle of the value chain. And so they'll be, up and down quite evenly. And of course, despite us having primes, I'm talking about the majority of the sector here. And when we look at those various concerns we saw 2 slides ago about whether they're set for suppliers or set by customers, you can see that on balance, it's fairly closely grouped, but overall, the UK's manufacturing sector is ever so slightly more likely to be subject to requirements than they are to set them, which is represented by the red and orange bars respectively there. But really eking out the difference between those larger and smaller firms, this really helps clarify it. When we look at the proportion of each category, whether it's large corporates or SMEs that have ESG conditions set on procurement, we have 93% in the large category reporting that they do have conditions, ESG related conditions set on their procurement strategy, versus still a high figure, but notably a gap between those large and smaller companies. 69% SMEs reporting that they have conditions on procurement. Interestingly, exposure in terms of those companies reporting being subject to conditions is far more balanced at 79 and 76%. Now, onto the last couple of slides. One of the curious points we wanted to understand was the amount of training and assistance up and down the supply chain. And we can see here, so this is representing the percentages of companies that report either being in receipt of one of these points of assistance to aid them on their ESG targets or journey or whatever agreement there might be, versus them helping their customer deliver it. Access to training is the most prevalent in both cases, but with the sector being far more likely to provide support to suppliers than to be in receipt of it. But I think the main thing to take away here is the none category, right at the very bottom, which shows pretty much in both cases the overwhelming majority up and down the chain are not providing or nor in receipt of assistance to meet their ESG targets. So what are some of the key highlighted challenges? This is really just a really simple pull out from a lot of the interviews, a lot of the written responses we received as part of this. A common theme, really 2 common things, the major big text things are worries about long-term budget commitments. So not just the one-off cost, but the long-term implications of cost of adopting, an ongoing ESG strategy. And then the other one is around vision and leadership and a thought of it not being necessary. Now, the report goes into this in depth and, some rather amusing sayings such as, perhaps in past it was seen as a nice to have, but it's very rapidly so becoming a need to have in many value chains in order to be able to tender for business, particularly internationally, and particularly when we look at how the legislation's evolving in the Scandinavian companies, if and when you do business with them. Now, finally, really is the last 2 slides, buy-in. We wanted to understand what about internal buy-in? So, not just leading from the top about the, could you estimate how much of your percentage of your, total workforce is in agreement or not in agreement with your procurement strategy? Quite strong, 64% consider themselves to have internal buy-in for their ESG strategy. However, 1/3 report not having sufficient resources to meet the ESG targets that are set upon them or as part of their contracts, which is a really interesting interplay between we've seen the majority of the sector not providing nor being in receipt of support to meet those targets, at the same time having 1/3 of the sector say they don't quite have the resource to meet those. So there's a gap there. But very finally, on an upbeat note, about the future, the extremely small percentage expect to contract the ESG endeavors in the coming 2 years, with actually an overwhelming amount, 60%, suggest that they'll have growth in that concern. Now, of course, I mentioned to you a couple of slides back, or 3 or 4 slides back, when we saw that growth, that was between 21 and 2023, which is a very challenging time for the UK's manufacturing sector, where focus was doubtless placed in other areas. So on the back of this, we do think these concerns, if we were to survey this again, which we may well do in about a year's time, we'll find the rate of the growth in those concerns most likely to have been even faster than the quite significant growth, particularly around targets, that we saw in the 2 years prior. Thank you very much. I will hand you back to Jonty now.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, James. It's a really interesting overview. And we're going to go next to Alice Conway from Lloyds Bank. And Lloyds also were working with Make UK on this survey. And I think Alice is just going to give her response and talk to us about the challenges and the opportunities for manufacturers. Alice, off you go.
Thanks very much, Jonty. I'll just pop my slides up on screen. I promise you there's not very many of them. to get through, and hopefully here we are. Okay, so I thought I'd start by kind of posing a question in the context of everything that James has talked about, which will hopefully become a poll that you can answer through the Q&A function, of how many people on the call either have spoken to their bank about ESG or would speak to their bank about ESG, either the strategy you're setting, your KPIs, or things that you're worried about. I'll come back to this a little bit later, but I'm really keen to see how many of you think your banks can help maybe fill some of the gaps that we're seeing that was the outcome of the survey. And while I let you answer those questions, I'll kind of go through what Jonty mentioned and think about what are kind of some of the key challenges that we're seeing, not only through the survey we did with Make UK, but through the work that we do with manufacturers on a daily basis. So I think that the kind of overall view that we see in the report is that, my gosh, there's a lot to be thinking about with ESG. The progress has been incredible, as James mentioned, in the last couple of years, especially given everything manufacturers have been facing across the board. But there is little consistency in approaches to things like supply chain management reporting requirements. And when we speak to our larger corporate manufacturers, they say they want to set procurement standards, but they are aware of the resource constraints and issues that SMEs in their supply chain might face trying to meet those. Manufacturing in its very nature is quite a difficult to abate sector, which means that it's harder to decarbonise than some of the other sectors that we see. And there are really valid concerns about engaging at all in ESG because of greenwashing allegations and a higher concern about greenwashing we've seen in the last year or so. Some technology like AI integration that could help accelerate sustainability has quite high barriers to entry. It's very expensive. We've got a shortage of skills, and like James said, the macroeconomic environment has been really challenging. But I really firmly believe there are so many reasons to be hopeful about manufacturing. And I say this as someone who's worked with manufacturing SMEs and large corporates for the last 4 years of my career. And the things that I've seen have filled me with so much hope about the future for more sustainable manufacturing. I think that manufacturers, maybe more than any other sector in the UK economy, have such a power and ability to make change for good. And as James mentioned, strong sustainability credentials will be essential in the future for helping you grow your business and win contracts. We think that there's also a huge cost efficiency to be gained from looking at some sustainability initiatives, particularly around energy usage. And as the report showed, customers really demand sustainable goods and services. It's a huge part of popular opinion now. And staying ahead of upcoming kind of regulatory and reporting requirements now will make the future much easier as these become more significant. And there's, I think, a really good amount of access to funding available, both from grants and subsidies from government, but also from private finance, where applying to your bank, ESG is highly likely now to be a question as part of the due diligence that we do. And I think also really, really importantly, thinking about some of those skills gaps we see, sustainable practices in your business is, in my opinion, one of the top ways to attract and retain really good talent, where I think a lot of people see that as absolutely essential. So back to that question of, would you talk to your bank? And when I close my slides, I'll have a look at how many people said they would or they wouldn't. My hypothesis is that you absolutely should speak to your bank. And I would love to believe that everybody on this call banks with Lloyds, but there are other banks available. But I wanted to highlight some of the really incredible things that I think we offer for manufacturing in particular, to support maybe filling some of those gaps if you're facing requirements in your supply chain, whether that's up or down. And regardless of the size of your business, there are lots of things that we can do to help. So for SMEs, we have specialist relationship managers who can help you with funding for anything that you might need to do. We've also got a lot of free tools, which I think are really compelling because, as I mentioned, they are free. You don't have to pay to use them, which can help you assess the carbon footprint of your physical buildings, which is always a really phenomenal place to start. And then we have a partnership with the Manufacturing Technology Centre, which offers free sustainability line walks for manufacturing SMEs. So the MTC will send in manufacturing experts and engineers to assess your business for sustainability improvement and help you come up with an action plan towards improving things about your processes or integrating new technology or ways that you could become more sustainable. And then on the large corporate side, we have a specialist sustainability advisory function, which I'm extremely proud to be a part of, that has now more than 35 experts from across industry, finance, and all kind of walks of life to help you build your strategy, your KPIs and targets. And as James mentioned, we see a lot of people don't have both or maybe have one. We can help you with advice and support on integrating those and creating something, as well as helping on procurement strategies. So we really do cover all bases. We provide a lot of great free insight on our website that's available for anybody, regardless of whether you bank with us. Of course, that's all publicly available. And then, of course, we offer funding to help you, which can be linked to your sustainability targets or specific green projects. And that's kind of just some of the highlights of the things that we can offer. And we can send round links to some of these key pages that I've shown here on the slide afterwards. Before I finish, unfortunately, I do have to leave the wordy disclaimer on slide just for a minute to say that everything that you have heard today is not necessarily representative of the group. And as I mentioned, other banks are very much available to you. But I just wanted to say thank you, and I'll exit now and have a look at that poll. Just really interested to see how many of you, so 80% said you would not talk to your bank. And that I think is really interesting. And I really hope in just those few minutes, I've maybe swayed a few of you that maybe you should be talking to your bank, and that there is lots out there that your banking partners offer that can really help you on this sometimes very difficult and complex journey. But thank you very much, Jonty. I'll pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Alice. I'm sure lots of people will be talking to your bank and others as well. And somebody they do talk to is Make UK, and particularly Waleed, who's joining us now. What we'd like to hear from you, perhaps, is the perspective of working with manufacturers. You know, where are they up to, and what are they asking you for? What kind of help do they need?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonty, and good morning, everyone. It's interesting to hearing from about the reports, what the manufacturer has already replied, but also through the work with other manufacturer as well across the UK. It's very interesting because everybody's now talking about ESG. You probably heard the word CSRD. You probably heard the work about reporting to your clients, or reporting or asking your suppliers, as we have seen already from James' presentation. But just before we do that, there is a lot of question comes as well, Jonty, which is about, where is that coming from? Why I have to do this now? Why I have to speak to my bank, like what Alice was saying a minute ago? Well, there's a little bit of history which was gonna take a couple of minutes. This is not something new. This goes almost 50 years ago when we started first to have a standard reporting for our financial reporting for businesses and corporates. So back in the 70s, the International Accounting Standing Committee was established by different professional bodies in the UK, France, Norway, the US, in order to make sure that businesses, especially the big corporates, they can report on their finance and their financial performance across the board, whether they are performing in the US, in the UK, in Europe, or any other country. Moving forward into that, this has been already, rather than being an accounting, only become a finance. And the reason for that is many investments bodies, whether it's this bank or stock market, wanted to understand what's happening within this business and these corporates. So this has been transferred into the international finance reporting standards, and the board was already has been already established back in the beginning of the 2000s. In the EU, we have already the same thing as well. We have the EU committee, the European Union already established what we call European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. The idea of all of that is basically all the financial reports has the same look and the same way of having a look in that. Now, looking into the 2000s and coming to the really big event called Paris Agreement in 2015, businesses and government bodies realize, okay, we cannot just talk about only finance. We need also to realize what's happening to our business and our climate, because many of the business has been impacted by what's happening in the climate and climate change. And this is where we had asked businesses to report on things like non-financial reporting. And this is where came a directive like non-financial reporting directive by the EU back in 2014. At the same time as well, we had the task force for reporting on non-financial and climate-related task force, which is established back in 2017. These all bodies were asking businesses and corporates in order to report on non-financial related topics such as climate change, sustainability, what they do to community. And if you remember back in the late 2000s, beginning of 2010s, we had already what we call CSR, corporate social responsibility. So businesses were saying, we'll try to do this, we'll try to be nice to the environment, we'll try to be nice to the community. There was no regulation, really strong regulation to push into that. Coming to another major event here back in the UK back in 2021, we had already the COP26, which two things happen at the same time. One is the task force on climate-related finance disclosures has already been adopted by the International Finance Reporting Standards to push businesses to report on climate change-related finance performances, meaning if you're going to invest in something, you have to show to investors, such as the banks, let's say like Lloyds, or any stakeholder or stock markets or shareholders, why you want to invest, let's say, in climate change mitigation or adaptation. At the same time in Europe, they were sitting down and say, ooh la la, we're not going to wait for that. We need to do something as well. So this is where they had the proposal at the same year for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which came into force in 2022 and has been adopted last year. The idea of all of that is basically to have transparency about the businesses, what they do, and how they actually do steps to tackle sustainability matters, not only just environmental, climate change only, and the focus is not only about climate change, but also to tackle issues related biodiversity, water, pollution from the environmental part, or from the social part, looking into your own workforce, your supplier workforce, communities, your end of product, how it's impact communities, and so on. And also from the governance part, how you invest and why you need to invest into that. So when Alice was asking about why should you talk to your bank, is basically if you want to raise your capital, for example, or if you want to invest more in your business, you will have, as Alice said correctly, most bank and investment body now are looking into ESG. Another important thing is as well, which many business didn't realize that until recent years, especially the last year and this year, that many of the public tenders are now asking for ESG credential and reporting, meaning they want to know what are you planning to do in the next few years in order to tackle things related to your business and climate change, circular economy, biodiversity, and water. And that depends from one business to another. So yes, ESG maybe started a long time ago and it started about reporting, but it's not just about the big corporates. It's now affecting everyone, and it's kind of understanding what you do. And as we see from the presentation by James as well, basically we have already thought about why you need to report on all of these. What is this is important for the near future. I am an SME, but remember, this regulation is not only targeting the big, what we call them the big boys, the 500 million plus or 500 employee plus. Any companies now will have to show transparency. You have already stakeholders, clients, community that are interested in your business. They want to know what are you doing to help the local community? What does your product impact, not only here locally in the UK, but also internationally? And finally, if you wanted to sell to other, or you want to be a client of one of these companies, they will come back to you. So what did you do to tackle climate change? What did you do to tackle circular economy? How did you stop pollution in your business? How did you, for example, inspect your suppliers? Do you think that your suppliers maybe have things related to modern slavery, or have you already policies to anti-bribery? You may think, yes, but I'm not under the threshold of the UK regulation. But this will be asked because you are part of their supply chain. Now, someone have asked me that while I'm going as well, John T, with UK manufacturer, they said, well, this is all EU, maybe US as well, because we have the US Secretary Exchange Committee already passed regulation last year related to reporting as well, similar to the CSRD. However, the UK already started into this, and just wanted to highlight that we have two regulations that came out back in 2022. So the first one is climate-related financial disclosure regulations, and we have also the limited liability partnership or climate-related financial disclosure regulation in 2022. These two regulations are target the businesses over 500 employees or having a more than 500 million turnover annually. Meaning, if you're dealing with one of these companies, again, they will have to ask a question related to your environmental, social, and governance. So yes, this is unfortunately, if business think they don't have the resources or things like that, I don't want you to worry, and we're happy here in Make UK to help you with that. But think about this is basically a step forward to understand what your business do, but also to protect your business. Because if your business is growing, and I hope that's happening, as we heard earlier, we had some difficulties in the last 2 years, but economy is going, and it's really good for UK manufacturers to see that expanding. But if you want to raise capitals by any means, whether it's through a loan from the bank, you're going to put shares in the stock market, or you're going to have a private investment, ESG is the key to gain and get more financial support for your business. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Walid. That's very interesting. Now we're going to turn to basically the shop floor, I suppose, and John Thewlis, who's MD at Thomas Broadbent, a manufacturing company in Yorkshire, an SME, I think quite a large, say medium-sized company. John, what are the driving factors for developing an ESG strategy? Because it sounds like it's happening very quickly and it's coming from quite a few angles.
It certainly is. If I can just give a little bit more context over what Broadbent does, so it may help people understand where we're coming from, why we're adopting or developing an ESG strategy. We are a classic manufacturer. We buy raw materials, we transform them into something, we assemble it and test it and ship it across the world. It takes us 12 months to do this. It costs millions of pounds. But we also serve the domestic market. We serve the international market. We cover the big petrochemical boys. We cover the NHS. So we've got a wide spectrum of customers, products and markets we serve. Outside the UK, the biggest market's the Far East. So what's the drivers, John T? The answer is, well, it's creeping towards us, isn't it? NHS, one of my colleagues deals with the NHS, and I asked him this morning what kind of question he's getting, and one of the questions he has to answer is, how is your product going to help my ESG, etc. So it's coming down the line. And of course, we deal with financial institutions. We've got large projects, they need money to fund them, and we ask our bank to be cooperative. And of course, they're interested in what are we doing to save the world, etc. In some cases, we found that the tenders are being marked, and they're being marked to include an element of ESG. It may not be the biggest, most important factor, but it's there. We are currently using a few weasel words to get away with it, but we can't paper over the cracks for much longer. Some of our competitors are ahead of us, and I suppose I could argue, is there a moral requirement to do something about it anyway? And of course, the other kind of possibility is that some of our employees, future employees, may find it attractive. So for us, in really simple words, ESG is creeping towards us, and it's unstoppable, I think. We're going to have to do something. We have to get on board. It should be a business advantage when we've got it. I hope so. It's a bit, the risk reward is quite a complicated question. We're also more likely to pass the threshold very soon in terms of, if we expand much more, in terms of we're going to have to do it anyway. So we need to get on with it and be ahead of the curve. I mentioned the balance risk against reward. Oh, crikey, that's a difficult one to answer. But I know if we don't do it, we risk being excluded. Is it going to disappear now that Donald Trump's in? No. even if Donald Trump throws it all out, the Europeans and the rest of the world, in my opinion, is going to continue doing it. We are going to have to get on board, and that's that. So that's our motivation. We have to do it. So that's what we're doing. So over to Charlotte to explain what we're doing and how we're going to do it.
Yes, I should just explain. Charlotte Ilkew is head of HR at Thomas Broadbent. Thank you very much for that, John. It's very, very interesting and very clear. So Charlotte, it sounds like you're at the cutting edge of this. What's the best practice and what are you doing? What's your approach?
So we're running a bit out, so I'll keep it brief. But what I would recommend to any SMEs, there's a lot of help out there that I probably didn't realise. Things like Make UK, things like West Yorkshire Combined Authority, local unis, all these people have an interest, you know, like yourself, Alice, the banks, and there's all these resources out there to tap into. I've gone to peer groups, which then open the door to other people, and it's making them connections. And I think that is when you start to realise you're not the only business at the same point as ourselves. It's very hard. We, like you've discussed earlier, we don't have anybody for ESG. It has fallen on my lap, and you know that is a thing that in the future, if we are to carry on, you know, going on our ESG journey at the pace that we probably need to, it needs to have its dedicated resource. It cannot just be head of HR's job every couple of weeks when I find the time to give it a bit of love and attention. So where we've got to now, we've got a policy. We've got a 2024 ESG report with all our metrics. We can only move forward from here and obviously collate data as of next year when we've got a comparison. So this is kind of where we're at. One thing I would say, it's coming up more in terms of like apprenticeships. So when we go out to the colleges, when we go out to the schools, when we're on an open day, you've got children asking these questions, and that becomes a bit of like a unique selling point between, you know, yourselves and another manufacturer or another engineering business. The parents want to know, you know, what are you doing about ESG? Have you got a policy you can share? And it's the little bits that are coming up and things like that. Recruitment. So a massive thing we've done for ESG at Broadbent is gone to a 4-day week. So obviously on the 5th day, you don't use the heating, you don't use electricity. In turn, when you're recruiting, it's such, you know, people are like, what, you only do 4 days? You know, it isn't like a 9-day fortnight or anything like that. It attracts so many more candidates. And in the industry that we're in, the amount of people that say, I never thought I'd get that in an engineering firm. And in this return, it helps us on our gas, electricity, and, you know, retention and recruitment. So there is both sides of it, you know, that is really attractive to other employers. I'd say one more thing that I would recommend is going out to the unis, looking for grads, interns that are wanting a placement. That's our next step. I've been in contact with the council and the University of York, Leeds and Huddersfield, and that's ideally to try and get somebody to come give us a hand. I'm no expert, you know, Waleed, I don't have half the knowledge that you have, but if we get that grad intern, that'll just be the next step on our journey. And that's pretty much what we've done here at Broadbent.
Excellent. If I could just ask you one question, Charlotte.
Yeah.
Is the pressure coming from the companies you supply, or is it just across the whole industry? Or is it the big companies who say, you're part of our structure now, we need you to do ESG so we can do it further up the line?
Yeah, I'd say it's a bit of both. So obviously we do some work for universities and NHS and MOD. Them are your sorts of people that are interested. Your company, you know, we work for some people that won't be interested in it whatsoever because of where they're located, what products they use, what they're going to use our product for. And it couldn't be further away from an ESG strategy if they tried. But the ones who are, it's creeping up in terms of, you know, we send apprentices to colleges. Again, the colleges are asking if we want to partner with them, what's our ESG strategy. The more and more little bits are asking questions that we wouldn't have really thought of previously.
Excellent. Thank you. That's very clear. It's an important point as it seems to be going on everywhere. So let's come back to Alison at Lloyds Bank first. It sounds a very complicated issue, and as we see, some SMEs, they haven't got the resources yet, they haven't made the commitment, yet they're under all these pressures. What can their bank do for them?
I think what people, I hope I sort of emphasise, people aren't aware of is how much your bank can help you with the things that Charlotte has mentioned, like finding your local peers, figuring out whether your local authority has grants and subsidies and programs available for you. Your bank, if it's Lloyds, has partnerships across the sector. So we work with Make UK, we work with the Manufacturing Technology Centre, we work with the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, we work with the West Midlands Combined Authority. And so those kind of partnerships that your bank is highly likely to have, whether it's Lloyds or another firm, can really support you in getting started and finding those experts in your local area, or sending an expert to you who can help you kind of start the journey. And then I think obviously the most important thing for SMEs that we can help you do is bridge some of that funding gap, where there's not going to be the resources to maybe think about wholesale changes to your business. And that's not what's required here. A lot of the time what's required is small things around the edges that we can help you finance, whether that's thinking about a slightly more energy efficient piece of equipment or a slightly different way to do your procurement. Those are all things that your financing partners can support you with. And so I think that would be my kind of shout is, if you're an SME and really struggling, please do talk to your relationship manager at your banking partner. It is highly likely that they've got free resources or contacts that you can use to at least start. And then from there, I think once you ask the first question and start giving it a go, you will find things start to come a bit more naturally and a bit easier. I'm not sure if Charlotte, if that's been your experience, but I think sometimes the hardest thing to do is just to start and take the first step. And I would say that your bank is a really good place to try and do that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Alice. I think it's getting it off the ground. It's what do I do first? And, you know, like you say, talking to the banks, I felt really lucky with going to a peer group, and there was a very similar sized company, engineering again. And, you know, the guy looked at me and he said, I don't even know where to start. So we kind of just did a bit of brainstorming, shared a bit of best practice. And between us, you know, we have kept in touch, and it's just sharing that knowledge. And I found working with peers was just so helpful.
Excellent. Thank you very much. By the way, anyone who's attending this webinar and has any questions they want me to ask, you have a chance. You can put your questions in, and I will ask them for you. So please do that now. But before we do that, let's come back to Waleed again. So it may sound a bit like I'm proposing a box ticking exercise, but is there some kind of, you know, pro forma, this is how you set it up, this is how you run an ESG, these are the things you have to do, it's tick, tick, tick. Is that, can that Make UK help you with that kind of thing?
Yeah, of course. This is a very interesting question, John, here, and I'm coming back what even Charlotte and John was talking about. Is just where it could be overwhelming sometimes, but this is where we can help for our members. So, for example, I remember when I went to met John, Charlotte and Thomas Broadbent, and I explained what is ESG. As James said in the presentation earlier today, many of the business is the buy-in. Many, when it comes to the name sustainability, give it to the environmental manager or the HSC manager. But sometimes the senior leadership don't understand that this is everybody's work, because there is an E, S, and G, hence the name. So it's everybody work. It's basically a collaboration. You may need somebody to drive that within the business, but every part of the business need to have that. And this is where we come to do and help the businesses. One, we can actually help the business by enlighten or explain more in details for the senior leadership team. So we have a half-a-day workshop or training to senior leadership team, and we can explain exactly what is ESG, who's going to be involved, and why this is important for the business, whether you are an SMEG or a corporate. So we have done that to many of our members. That's one. But the other part is important is to understand what else I need to. So when you look at the ESG itself, there is a lot of disclosure, especially when it's related to regulation like the CSRD. We do a gap analysis, which is mainly we can understand what exactly you need and what you have in place and what you need to work on. In other words, we highlight what already has been done in the business in terms of like, is there any climate change initiative, like what Charlotte said earlier about energy efficiency or working 4 days, what also the social aspect within the business, workers and apprenticeship, working with the local communities, but also the financial part related to the E&S as well. So we do the gap analysis to help the business and understand where should I start from, because it can be overwhelming. And I understand that, especially if you are an SMEs or you don't have the resources, then we come here and help you. We say, this is maybe what you need to focus on to start with. These are maybe the things you need to start with. And we can follow up on that with building the framework for the ESG, whether it's about the data required, building the KPIs, and also the report framework itself. Because for SMEs, it can be challenging to collect all the data, understand where is the data is going to come from, what could be the methodologies. Because very important thing about ESG, and especially when it's related to regulations such as the CSRD, that it has to be an approved methodologies. So for example, if you're going to say, I am going to calculate my carbon footprint, you need to follow a specific and approved methodologies, for example, such as Science-Based Target Initiative or Race to Net Zero by the United Nations Global Compact. So it's important that you understand you're not alone. We're here in Make UK can help you, and we can give you the steps exactly where and how you can follow the framework, and we can work with you in that journey. Thank you very much. And I'd like to actually go back to John Hewlett at Broadbent. It just struck me that when Charlotte was talking about, well, some people like the NHS and the MOD just insist on this kind of stuff, that actually that's quite a good template, isn't it? If you know what they are, they must be setting, the gold standard, because government is trying to push this through. So presumably it was quite a challenge when they first did this, but does that mean next time you know what the pro forma is because you've done it for some of the most demanding people already?
Yeah, potentially. Like I said, at the moment we are fending it off and saying nice things. It's coming. We're planning, we're preparing, but eventually we're going to have to deliver. So yes, if we can pass the test of the UK government in all its various forms, I guess that we should be able to satisfy anybody. But when we talk about major, I mentioned some of our customers are major petrochemical companies, including Americans, and they're interested and they're coming in. They come in auditors. Traditionally, they used to come in auditors and want to look at how we make things. Now they want to know how we make things and how we're not killing, rabbits and birds whilst we're doing it. So it is changing.
Excellent, thank you. And Charlotte, the demands, you were saying that at the moment you're kind of fitting this in around other stuff, and maybe there is a graduate watching this as you get in touch with you and can help. But I thought it was really interesting that the apprentices and the people who want to come and work with you, they seem to be further ahead on this than nearly everybody else, that they really want to work for people who take this seriously.
Yeah, and I think that's massive in recruitment as well. The likes of your Unilevers, your grads, people like that, they've probably been, that's part of their syllabus maybe. It definitely wasn't when I was at school, but as things evolve, I do presume the education and the awareness of ESG is probably a lot bigger and a lot better in different things people do. So therefore, that is why they are asking them questions at the apprenticeship days. When people are interviewing, they are asking them sort of questions. And, it is, fingers crossed so far, working in our favour.
Excellent. And just one technical question. What part of manufacturing is most greatly influenced by this? Is it your use of energy or chemicals, or what? When you look at it, you kind of go, well, we're just going to have to stop that, or we're going to have to do something about this particular area.
Well, it can affect us in a number of ways. We're big users of energy, particularly in winter, for heating. This is why we've gone down to 4 days, 4 long days rather than 5 standard days. Yeah, it's not easy. If you have to cut metal, you have to find a new way of doing it. Can you change the manufacturing process to use different materials, different manufacturing processes? It requires a lot of thought It's not just simple as, the quick fixes of turning the lights out for a few days or turning the heating off. But ultimately, we're going to have to get a lot more sophisticated than that.
Thank you very much, John. We've had a question come in, which I'm going to throw to Alice from Lloyds Bank. Are these support avenues funded? Presumably, by government and other things, or do the SMEs just have to find the money and pay up for this themselves? Do you think?
So a lot of what is offered by Lloyds is free for SMEs. So you can get an introduction to partners for free. And then it really depends on what sort of support service you're looking for. An example would be in our partnership with the MTC, your initial line walk and review plan is free. Follow-ups will need to be funded. However, the vast majority of those qualify for things like Innovate UK funding and subsidies. So often SMEs will only need to find up to 30 to 40% of the cost of that service, and they can get up to, in some cases, 80% of that funded through grants and subsidies, depending on what you can find with Innovate UK or your local combined authority. So my recommendation would be, when you're working with a sector partner, someone like Make UK or the MTC, they will know what's available to you in your regions, in your areas, and will be able to help you find that. And your bank is highly likely to know as well. So I think that's always a really good place to start. You can definitely get a lot of things at a reduced cost with those subsidies and grants that are available.
Thank you. And we've actually had a second question, which you could probably take, Alice, which is, as a lender, do you offer preferential rates or terms for the greener projects? Or, presumably, this is why you have an ESG department, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So the very short answer is yes, we do. That's obviously subject to terms and conditions on what the project is, what the business looks like. For SMEs, it will tend to be things that are a bit more binary. So are you buying a new piece of equipment for your factory that improves the efficiency of that process by 40% or 50%, for example, and that would qualify for a discount. On the large corporate side, we tend to link your discounted financing to your company targets, whether those are emissions reductions or improvements in usage of water, or even ways you're thinking about improving the biodiversity of the areas around you. So they look a little bit different depending on the size of the business, but yes, absolutely, discounted finance for green projects or green businesses is pretty much now the industry standard.
Thank you very much. And we've got an interesting question for you, Waleed, which basically goes back to that thing about, there are things we know, there are things we don't know, and there are things we don't know, which does come into ESG, because someone is asking, we don't know what we don't know regarding, requirements and so on and the law. Is there a generic audit, an ESG audit, or a pro forma way of reviewing this that's available to everybody?
Yes, we carry out what we call a ESG gap analysis, and basically that's to go to your business and understand what is your business is related to ESG and how you can perform or present your ESG report and KPIs. That will be different from one business to another, because basically we need to understand what's the financial, and whether you are a part of a group or you're already in a standalone company, whether you work only in the UK or you have customer abroad, let's say in the US or the EU. Are you part as a branch, or you have branches in the EU? So each business will be different. This is specifically where we go into the business and do that gap analysis. The reason for that is because there is a lot of requirements and threshold within the regulation. So it's not a straightforward answer. I would say, if somebody say, I'm just a small company, I'm an SMEs, and I don't need to do an ESG. To be honest, as we heard earlier, you will have to report an ESG, whether it's this year, next year, or later on. But we need to understand, when do you need to do that, whether you will need to do that next year, 2025, whether you need to do that immediately because your clients or your main customers is asking for that, or whether you are part of a group, or you're already trading in the EU, or you're trading in the US. All of these factors we explore and explain during our ESG audit. gap analysis audit, and that basically does highlight what is the business already current situation and what is expected and what is the timeline for meeting such as regulation like the CSRD. That can be carried out depends on the business, for example, size and for example, and operation. So it could be 1 to 2 days, it could be more than that. It depends about, and we have that conversation. Please get in touch with us and we can carry out that. That's not a problem at all. I think John, you are in mute, sorry.
My fault. I didn't.
No problem.
I didn't take myself off on mute. My fault. To John and Charlotte, then maybe finally, what are some immediate low-cost actions that manufacturing companies can take? I mean, you were talking about turning the lights off and working a 4-day week, which does sound a bit dramatic, actually. But I mean, these things work for you, don't they? So
well, they do. Yes, they have worked for us. To be honest, the drive to put energy because the Russians invaded Ukraine. The price of energy went through the roof. So a consequence of that is we had to cut our energy bill. So, but it counts as it counts as E, I suppose, insofar as we now work 4 long days and turn the heating off on a Friday. We consulted with our employees, we got them on board. They recognize it, and employees do understand at least some of what it's all about, not all of it. And the employees want the company to be successful, so we have to do something. Quick fixes were tricky. Like I said, work with your employees, see what they can come up with. Let them give you some suggestions about how they can improve efficiency and save money.
Yeah, I think for the quick fixes, John, one of our next steps is to make some working groups, some sustainability working groups, and get people's opinion on what they want to see from an employer. Because the more people I speak to, the bigger businesses they have, environmental or sustainable working groups. So that's our next thing, and see what our employees want from us and what changes they want to help drive forward. So I'd just say, it's about letting the employees have a voice and then taking that low-hanging fruit whilst you can.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to go back to James, who we haven't heard from since the beginning. Just for one thing, one of the interesting things was just how quickly this is coming for everybody. Could you just go through that again? There's been a huge change, and it's going to keep accelerating, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think so not only are we seeing that growth come through, but I think the real message that we found through this working through Lloyds, working through with our members and Lloyds as clients is, especially the international operators, with one sentence, it's really very rapidly moving from a nice to have to a need to have. So moving from the place where you might win more business, or as Alice has mentioned, you might be able to get preferential lending rates from your financial partners, into you cannot participate into this value chain unless you can demonstrate these targets. You cannot win this business. So that's really where it's evolving very quickly. And so I think if that's one thing that I've observed as a pundit in this is that shift, and that's what I'm seeing accelerate.
Excellent.
Interestingly, I've not seen much of this coming from Asia, the Chinese. I don't know if anybody can comment on that. The Western world is definitely on board. Asia, I'm not so sure.
I can comment on this,
Yes,
John.
John.
So
Sorry.
in terms of, I think the Chinese kind of like they wait and then they execute later on. So we have seen that with some other related regulation like CBAM. As we speak now, the Chinese already looking into implementing a Chinese equivalent CBAM from their end, but they're waiting to see how that will be implemented in the EU. Similar like what happened previously with similar directive, like the WE directive, the ROS directive. The Chinese also waited a couple of years until that came into force to understand how that will be implemented. They already have exactly the same Chinese version there. So I think maybe China is a little bit behind, but I don't think they will wait for long, and that will be exactly the same. Especially if we understand that many of the products, some we get raw material from there to remanufacture or done here in the EU or in the UK. But then it's being sold as a whole product or a final product in China. And if we have this kind of pressure on businesses from China to meet regulation here, the Chinese and other Far East found it easier to copy and paste exactly the same and change it from, let's say, WE directive, European directive into Chinese directive, exactly the same. So I wouldn't see that for long. And it will be similar to what we have here in the EU, which make it easier, to be honest, because again, we don't have to re-explain or we don't have to re-understand what the regulation is about from previous experience.
Yeah, I suppose if you meet the highest regulations, then you meet everybody's regulations, don't you?
Exactly, yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you all very much for that. It's about time we went. That was all very valuable input, and thank you so much. Especially thanks to Charlotte and John from Thomas Broadbent for what we can see from the shop floor, so to speak. Also to Alice from Lloyds Bank, Waleed and James from Make UK. I'm John T. Bloom. Thank you for joining us on this webinar. We all hope you found it useful. And now, if you will stay with us just a few seconds, Carolee is going to explain how you can get even more out of this webinar. Carolee.
Thank you, John T. Yeah, so there's a couple of questions that you'll all notice have not been taken yet by the panel. So there's about 4 questions. We will follow up with each of them and be able to get a response back. Some are asked anonymously, so we'll send them to the whole list. Those that were asked directly by an individual, we'll just get in touch with you directly to respond to that answer. We will also share the link for this, the YouTube link for this as well. And there's a final survey just when you're closing out. We do ask you just to take a couple of seconds to respond to that. And if you do wish for anybody from the panel to be in touch with you directly, we'll make sure that happens as well. Thank you all for joining. Goodbye.